A handful of salt once bought a goat with nothing more than a handshake. Ancient markets were the true engines of civilization, operating on hidden social codes that you have never been taught. By the end of this journey, you will see every empire in history as a direct product of its marketplace. How did a simple trade in a dusty square transform into the power that built Rome and connected the Silk Road? What unwritten rules of trust allowed strangers to build a global economy without a single coin? The roots of our modern world are buried in these forgotten agreements. What does it truly take to build an economy from the ground up? That dusty square where the goat was traded was far from a random spot. It was a carefully chosen piece of sacred ground. In a world of tribal conflicts and constant suspicion, the marketplace was the one place declared neutral. A local chieftain or a village elder would often dedicate the space under the watchful eye of a powerful deity, promising protection to anyone who came to trade. This was not just a practical decision, it was a spiritual one. The market became a temporary sanctuary, a bubble of enforced peace in a violent world. This was the birth of the first and most important social code, the peace of the market. Think of it as an ancient, unspoken treaty. Inside this boundary, your weapons were sheathed, your grievances were set aside, and your primary identity shifted from warrior or stranger to trader. This guaranteed safety was revolutionary. It meant a farmer from one valley could confidently bring his grain to meet a herder from the distant hills, each trusting they would leave with their lives and their new goods intact. Without this foundational trust, enforced by tradition and spiritual belief, no complex trade could ever begin. This simple act of marking a space as special transformed it from a mere location into a crucible for civilization itself. It was here, within this protected zone, that the first inklings of law and order began to emerge. Disputes over the quality of goods or the fairness of a barter had to be settled on the spot, often by a respected elder. This created a need for predictable rules, for common standards of value that everyone present would understand and accept. The sacred ground of the market did not just host trade, it actively forged the very concept of a reliable, rules-based community. This was the essential first step, the quiet agreement that made every other economic miracle possible. But within that sacred space of peace, a far more intricate dance was unfolding. The exchange of a clay pot for a bundle of wheat was never just about the objects themselves. It was a silent conversation, a complex ritual weaving a web of social obligation that stretched far beyond the market's boundary. This was the second code, the unspoken currency of human connection. The act of giving something created an immediate and powerful social bond. It placed a debt upon the receiver, a debt not of coins but of honor. This was the concept of gift debt. You did not simply take a pot and walk away. You accepted a future responsibility to repay the favor, often with something of equal or sometimes even greater perceived value. This repayment might not happen that day or even that season. It created a lasting link between two people and by extension between their families or clans. Think of it not as a simple swap, but as planting a seed of future cooperation. A herder receiving grain in a lean year was bound by this social code to offer a healthy kid goat when his own flocks thrived. This system transformed a simple transaction into a promise. It was an economic engine powered by reciprocity and trust. The goal was not merely to acquire a resource, but to actively strengthen your social network. In a world of scarcity, these webs of mutual obligation were your ultimate insurance policy. Your survival could one day depend on the strength of the relationships you had forged in the marketplace. This code ensured that cooperation was not just a nice idea, but a fundamental, binding rule of life. The market was the loom on which the very fabric of community was woven, thread by thread, trade by trade. Yet this web of social debt required a shared grammar, a way to ensure that a gift of grain was understood to be worth one goat and not two. That need gave rise to the third and perhaps most tangible code, the unspoken language of weights and measures. Before any standardized coins existed, how could you possibly trust a stranger from a distant land to give you the full amount of copper you were promised? The answer was found in objects of certified trust. Across the ancient world, authorities created physical standards. In Mesopotamia, temple priests carefully carved stone weights in units known as the shekel and the mina. In Egypt, official scribes used copper rings called debans to measure value. These were not mere tools, they were a revolutionary social agreement made solid. A trader from the Indus Valley could place a merchant's lump of copper on one side of a simple balance scale, and an official stone weight from a Mesopotamian temple on the other. When the scale balanced, a deal was struck. There was no need for a common spoken language, no requirement for complex negotiations. The silent equilibrium of the scale spoke a universal tongue of fairness. This system transformed abstract value into something you could hold in your hand. The power to create and certify these standards was immense. Whether it was a palace, a temple, or a powerful guild of merchants, the institution that guaranteed the weight became the bedrock of economic trust. It prevented conflicts before they could even start, eliminating the constant fear of being cheated. This common language of measurement allowed trade to explode in scale and scope. A merchant could travel 1,000 miles, confident that a mina of silver in one city would hold the same value in the next. This was the quiet revolution that truly connected empires, building a framework of reliability that made the world feel smaller and trade infinitely safer. That silent language of weights and measures could only take trust so far. Across the vast deserts and along the winding sea routes, a far more personal currency came into play, one that traveled with the merchant themselves. In a world without contracts or courts that could follow you, your reputation was everything. It was your passport, your credit line, and your most fragile possession. A merchant's good name, painstakingly built over years of consistent deals and honest measure, became a form of capital as valuable as any chest of silver. This was the fourth code, the unwritten power of personal integrity. Consider the Assyrian merchant carrying tin and textiles across Anatolia. His success did not hinge solely on the quality of his goods, but on the stories told about him in every caravanserai. Was his word reliable? Did he deliver what he promised when he promised it? If the answers were yes, he could perform a kind of ancient magic. He could secure a warehouse full of goods on nothing but a promise to pay upon his return next season. This was the birth of long-distance credit, an economy built on a handshake and a reputation. A single broken promise could shatter that trust instantly. A merchant caught using false weights or selling watered-down wine would find themselves facing a punishment far worse than any fine. They faced economic exile. News would travel along the trade routes faster than any ship. Suddenly, no one would deal with them. Their access to the lifeblood of commerce was severed, leading to utter ruin. This system created a powerful, self-policing network. Ethical behavior was not merely a moral choice, it was a brutal economic necessity. The survival of an entire trade route, like the Incense Trail or the Amber Road, depended on the collective reputation of every merchant who used it. They were all bound together, their fates intertwined by this invisible web of mutual reliance. Your personal honor was not just your own, it was a shared resource that protected the entire community and enabled empires to breathe. Yet even the strongest reputation could not prevent every disagreement. A dispute over a delayed shipment or the quality of goods was a spark that could ignite a feud, threatening the fragile peace of the market. This danger gave rise to the Fifth Code, the authority of the neutral arbiter and the birth of formal contract law. When two traders reached an impasse, they turned not to force but to a respected third party. This could be a village elder, a temple priest, or a designated market official, someone trusted by all sides to understand the unwritten rules of commerce and community. Their role was not to punish but to resolve, drawing upon generations of customary law to find a fair solution. This shifted justice from a matter of personal vengeance to a community-based system. It meant a merchant from afar could seek redress without fearing the local chieftain would automatically side with his own kinsman. The decision of the arbiter was backed by the collective will of the marketplace, a powerful incentive for all parties to accept the judgment and move on. This system was so vital that it soon became written in stone. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal documents in the world, is filled with precise commercial regulations. It set maximum interest rates on loans of grain and silver, and it clearly defined the liabilities of a shipbuilder if his vessel proved faulty and sank with another merchant's cargo. These were not abstract ideals, they were practical rules for a functioning economy. They provided a predictable framework that gave traders the confidence to make complex deals with relative strangers. Knowing that a clear process existed for resolving conflicts made traders more willing to extend credit, fund risky voyages, and engage with outsiders. The neutral arbiter and the written code transformed the marketplace from a collection of individual transactions into a true institution, one where fairness was not just hoped for, but systematically enforced. This was the giant leap from a handshake to a legally binding handshake, a foundation without which no empire could ever hope to manage its vast economic networks. Even the most reliable market needed a pulse, a rhythm to draw the world closer. This rhythm was found in the great fairs and festivals. These were not merely larger markets, they were spectacular events where commerce became inseparable from culture. Think of the great festival of Dionysus in Athens, where crowds gathered for theatrical performances, or the seasonal fairs in medieval Europe timed with a saint's day. The primary draw was the celebration, the shared faith, the collective joy, but this gathering of thousands created a perfect storm for trade. A farmer coming to venerate a relic might also discover a new type of plow from a distant region. A merchant selling spices could hear news of a political shift that would affect his next voyage. The fairground became a chaotic, vibrant melting pot where goods, ideas, and technologies were exchanged as freely as gossip. The sanctity of the festival provided a powerful, temporary umbrella of peace, often stronger than any city wall. Pilgrims were protected by divine decree, and merchants rode in on their coattails. This system brilliantly masked the raw mechanics of buying and selling within a much richer social and spiritual experience. People were not just customers, they were participants in a shared ritual. This fusion ensured a guaranteed, regular influx of people from diverse backgrounds, creating an economic boom that felt more like a celebration than a transaction. By weaving commerce directly into the fabric of their most important cultural events, ancient societies guaranteed their economic heart would beat strong, year after year, renewed by the very rituals that defined their community. The vibrant chaos of the Great Fair, however, could not answer every need. For the most valuable commodities, a different kind of order was required, one built not on open competition but on guarded secrets and strict membership. This was the domain of the Seventh Code, the rise of the guild and its powerful monopoly on knowledge. These were far more than simple trade unions. They were the keepers of specialized, often sacred, information that entire cities and empires depended upon. Think of the legendary Tyrian purple dye, a color so rare and vibrant it became synonymous with royalty. The process for creating it from sea snails was a state secret, fiercely protected by a guild of dyers in the Phoenician city of Tyre. They did not just make a product, they controlled the very knowledge of its existence. Similarly, the Phoenician sailors themselves possessed navigation secrets passed from father to son, charting the Mediterranean by stars and currents that were a mystery to outsiders. This control over information created immense power. A guild was a closed system, but a highly efficient one. It rigorously enforced quality standards, ensuring that a sword from a master smith's guild would not shatter in battle, and a length of cloth from a weaver's guild met an exact specification. They trained apprentices through a long, rigorous system, passing down skills over generations and guaranteeing that complex crafts would not be lost. By controlling who could practice a trade and how it was done, guilds regulated competition, preventing market floods with shoddy goods. This created stability and protected the livelihoods of their members. The true power of the guild, however, lay in its ability to control not just what was traded, but how and by whom. They shaped entire industries from the ground up, turning individual crafts into enduring institutions. This system created a clear hierarchy, from lowly apprentice to journeyman to revered master. But it also ensured that the most valuable human knowledge, the kind that built cathedrals and spanned oceans, was preserved and perfected over centuries. It was a trade-off, a balance between open access and the deep, slow cultivation of expertise that would define the economic landscape for ages. Even the most powerful guild could not protect a merchant on a lonely mountain pass or a vast, empty desert. The Eighth Code addressed this fundamental vulnerability, transforming the very concept of a stranger's doorstep into a trader's sanctuary. Across the ancient world, from the bustling caravanserais of the Silk Road to the aristocratic homes of Greece, the sacred duty of hospitality was not a suggestion, it was a life-or-death social contract. A traveling merchant, far from home and vulnerable, could approach a designated host or a public inn and expect food, shelter, and protection from local threats. This was never seen as simple charity. It was a profound, reciprocal obligation that oiled the wheels of long-distance trade. In the Greek world, this bond was called xenia, a formal guest friendship ritualized and enforced by Zeus himself, the god of strangers. A host who refused a traveler or, worse, harmed them under their roof faced divine wrath and utter social ostracism. Their name would become mud, and no other merchant would ever seek them out, cutting their household off from the flow of goods and news. In return, the guest was bound by a strict code of conduct. They were expected to show immense gratitude, respect the host's property, and never overstay their welcome. This system created a predictable chain of safe houses stretching for thousands of miles. A merchant from Venice knew he could find refuge with his host friend in Constantinople, who in turn had a reciprocal arrangement with a trader in Alexandria. These were not just business contacts, they were personal bonds of loyalty that often passed from father to son, becoming a form of inherited social capital. The entire sprawling network of the Silk Road, with its countless caravanserais offering water, rest, and security, was a physical manifestation of this code. Without this web of enforced trust and sanctuary, the immense risks of long-distance travel would have made intercontinental trade impossible. The silks of China would never have reached Rome, and the spices of India would never have flavored European feasts. This ancient system of hospitality was the invisible infrastructure that held the arteries of empire open. proving that sometimes the strongest economic foundations are built not on law, but on the simple, sacred act of offering a weary traveler a meal and a safe place to sleep. But sometimes, even the sacred bond of hospitality could not bridge a gap of profound mutual suspicion. For cultures separated by impenetrable language barriers or ancient taboos against direct contact, commerce still found a way. This was the ninth code, the extraordinary practice of silent trade, a system of pure, abstract trust. Imagine a stretch of deserted beach or a clearing deep in the forest, a place designated by long tradition. One group, perhaps coastal dwellers with salt and dried fish, would arrive first. They would carefully lay out their goods on the ground and then retreat to a safe distance, completely vanishing from sight. Then the second group, maybe inland forest people with rare spices and animal skins, would emerge. They would inspect the offerings not with a haggling eye, but with a deep understanding of customary value. They would then place what they believed to be a fair counterpayment beside the goods, and they too would withdraw. The first group would return. If they found the payment acceptable, they would take it and leave, completing the transaction. If they were dissatisfied, they would simply leave the payment untouched and depart, signaling the deal was off. No words were ever spoken, no hands were ever shaken. No faces were ever seen. This entire intricate dance relied on a single, powerful force, a shared and unspoken commitment to fairness. Both sides understood that the desire for the other's unique goods was more important than the short-term gain of a one-sided cheat. To violate this trust was to sever the connection forever, losing access to vital resources. This was trust stripped to its barest essence, proving that the human drive to trade could build bridges across any chasm, even when the builders remained invisible to one another. While the silent trade proved that commerce could function without a single word, there was another, more intimate code operating in plain sight. This 10th code belonged to the hidden architects of the ancient marketplace, the women whose economic power formed the bedrock of daily life. Forget the image of the lone male merchant haggling over spices, for the true engine of the local economy was often managed by women. In the Assyrian merchant colonies of Anatolia, clay tablets reveal a startling reality. Women not only owned valuable property like houses and fields, but they also ran their own thriving businesses, lending silver at interest and managing complex trade deals entirely on their own authority. Their seals on contracts were as legally binding as any man's. Across the continent, in the bustling markets of West Africa, women controlled entire regional trade networks for centuries. They dictated the flow of essential goods like shea butter, pottery, and specially dyed textiles, their knowledge of local resources and community needs making them indispensable. This was not a side business, it was the core of the distribution system. Why were women so central to this level of trade? They were the masters of the local and the essential. While men might travel great distances for luxury items, women managed the critical trade in foodstuffs, everyday crafts, and household textiles. They possessed an intricate understanding of local supply and demand, of which village had a grain surplus and which faced a shortage. Their social networks were their greatest asset, a web of trust and information that allowed goods and wealth to circulate efficiently within and between communities. This daily, unglamorous work of feeding and clothing a society never made it onto grand monuments or into epic poems, but it was the very foundation upon which every empire was built. You cannot fund a king's army or a temple's construction if your people are not fed, clothed, and economically active at the most basic level. These women were the steady heartbeat of the market, the quiet force that turned raw resources into circulating wealth, proving that the most powerful economic codes are sometimes the ones history almost forgot to record. The quiet power of the local market, built on personal reputation and community trust, could not escape the notice of rising empires. These sprawling states saw in these organic systems something powerful to be harnessed, a tool for control on a scale never before attempted. This marked the birth of the 11th Code, the Imperial Seal, where standardization became the ultimate instrument of power. A king could not personally oversee every transaction in his vast domain, but he could impose a single, unbreakable rule of value. The invention of standardized coinage was the masterstroke. Think of the first Lydian staters, struck from electrum in the Kingdom of Lydia, or the iconic Athenian owl tetradrachms, their silver purity guaranteed by the city-state's authority. These were not mere pieces of metal, they were a revolutionary declaration. An empire could now dissolve the complex webs of barter and social debt into a single, universal metric. A farmer's wheat, a potter's jars, and a soldier's service could all be reduced to a number of coins. This was not just an economic convenience, it was a political revolution. Every time a merchant in a distant province accepted a coin stamped with the emperor's face or a city's sacred symbol, he was implicitly acknowledging that authority's power to define value itself. The transaction was no longer just between two people, it was a three-way agreement that included the state. This system made the empire's presence felt in the most mundane acts of daily life. The primary driver for this was brutally efficient administration. Standard coinage made taxation infinitely easier. A distant governor could demand tribute in silver owls, knowing their exact worth, rather than dealing with a chaotic mix of goods. This centralized wealth then flowed directly back to the capital, funding the very armies that enforced this system and built the roads that carried it. Uniform weights and measures, once a local guarantee of fairness, were now imposed by imperial decree. A bushel of grain was the same from the Nile Delta to the highlands of Anatolia, making surplus extraction predictable and reliable. The imperial seal transformed the vibrant, relationship-based economies of the past into a streamlined, top-down machine. It economically integrated countless diverse peoples, binding them to a central power not just by law, but by the very coins they used to buy their bread. The marketplace, once a crucible of community, had become an engine of empire. That imperial seal stamped on every coin did more than just standardize value. It accelerated the flow of something even more precious, information. While gold and silk traveled along the trade routes, the most valuable cargo was often intangible, whispered between merchants haggling over spices or shared over a meal in a caravanserai. The ancient marketplace was the world's first and most efficient intelligence network. A trader arriving from a distant port carried more than exotic goods, he carried news. His report of a poor harvest upriver meant grain prices would soon spike, a competitive secret worth a fortune to the merchant who heard it first. A rumor of a political assassination in a foreign capital could signal the collapse of a vital trade alliance, forcing a recalculation of entire business strategies. This constant, informal exchange of information created a powerful social code, one that made every merchant an unwitting agent in a global web of awareness. Kings and emperors locked in their palaces understood this perfectly. They often relied on these commercial networks for ground-level intelligence that their own official spies could not provide. A caravan master could report on the morale of a distant city's population or the movements of troops along a frontier with a detail no formal envoy could match. The marketplace gossip, buzzing with 1,000 different voices, became a filter for global reality. A rising tension between two tribes might first be detected not by a general, but by a sharp-eyed merchant who noticed a sudden reluctance to trade a certain type of wood or ore. This flow of information connected the world in a way that treaties and wars never could. It created a shared consciousness, a collective understanding of supply and demand, of risk and opportunity that spanned continents. The ability to accurately interpret this stream of data was a merchant's ultimate advantage, turning a simple trader into a geopolitical analyst. This code transformed the bustling, chaotic market into the central nervous system of the ancient world, proving that the most powerful connections are not always made of stone or silver, but of stories. That relentless flow of information and imperial ambition, however, ran into a powerful, ancient counter-current. For all the efficiency of coins and the reach of kings, a deeper social code insisted that some things were too important to be left to the market alone. This was the 13th code, the moral economy and the sacred idea of the just price. Long before modern economics, philosophers like Aristotle argued that every item had a true, natural value, and that selling it for more was a form of deception. This belief echoed across the ancient world. Buddhist texts condemned unfair trade, while Hindu teachings outlined strict ethical rules for merchants, especially regarding food. The concept was simple yet radical. A good, especially a staple like grain or bread, should be sold at a price that was fair. Fair meant the seller could earn a modest living, but it absolutely forbade exploiting a buyer's desperation during a famine or a siege. This was not about maximizing profit, it was about preserving the community itself. When a drought struck and wheat became scarce, a merchant might see a chance for immense wealth. But the community, often backed by religious authority, saw a threat to its very survival. In response, city officials from Rome to Baghdad would impose strict price controls on essential goods. They would set a maximum price for a bushel of grain, preventing speculators from hoarding supplies to drive up the cost. This was a direct intervention, a declaration that the social contract outweighed the laws of supply and demand. A baker was entitled to a profit for his labor, but he was not entitled to starve his neighbors for gain. This moral framework created a constant, quiet tension at the heart of commerce. It was a daily reminder that the market existed to serve the people, not the other way around. The bustling square, for all its competitive energy, was still bound by a shared understanding of justice, a final, vital check on the power of pure greed. Every transaction in the ancient marketplace was a delicate performance, a choreographed dance far more intricate than a simple exchange of goods. Haggling was never about raw confrontation. It was a highly structured social ritual, a 14th code essential for building rapport and establishing mutual respect. This was not a battle to be won, but a relationship to be formed. The dance began with the initial offer, a price set deliberately high by the seller, not out of greed, but as an invitation to begin the conversation. The buyer's counteroffer was not an insult, but an acceptance of that invitation. The feigned offense, the dramatic sighs, the walking away only to be called back, these were all expected steps. Each gradual concession was a sign of goodwill, a tangible demonstration that both parties were invested in finding a middle ground. The final agreement, always sealed with a handshake or the sharing of a drink, was more than a deal, it was a covenant. In many cultures across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, to skip this ritual and pay the first price offered was seen as profoundly rude. It denied the seller their role in the social performance, treating them as a mere vending machine rather than a respected partner in trade. By engaging fully in the dance, both the buyer and seller could walk away feeling they had achieved a small victory. The buyer secured a fair price, and the seller secured not just a sale, but a satisfied customer likely to return. This ritual transformed a simple purchase into a shared social experience, weaving another thread into the fabric of community trust. It proved that the true value of a transaction was not just in the object being traded, but in the human connection forged through the ancient, universal language of negotiation. The ancient handshake that sealed a deal was often just the beginning of a much longer story, one written in the language of debt. This 15th code was a double-edged sword, capable of building fortunes just as easily as it could destroy lives. Debt was the essential fuel for ambitious trade expeditions, allowing a merchant to purchase a ship and a cargo of olive oil on the promise of future returns from a distant market. It let a farmer buy seed for the next planting season, a vital investment in survival. Yet this same mechanism of trust carried a terrifying shadow, the very real specter of debt slavery. A single poor harvest or a ship lost at sea could force a free person to pledge not just their property, but their own body or the bodies of their family members as collateral. The social codes surrounding this precarious relationship were therefore a matter of life and death. A debtor was bound by an overwhelming obligation of honor, a duty to repay that defined their place in the community. Their reputation and their very freedom hung in the balance. Creditors held power, but it was often a power checked by tradition and law. In many societies, they could not simply seize a defaulting debtor's land at will, especially if it was their ancestral plot, the source of their family's identity. There were limits, at least in theory, to how far they could push a fellow citizen. The most dramatic expression of this social contract was the periodic debt amnesty. Mesopotamian kings, facing widespread unrest caused by masses of citizens trapped in servitude, would periodically issue edicts known as misharim, or justice acts. With a single proclamation, they would clean the slate, annulling personal debts and freeing those who had been enslaved by them. This was not an act of mere charity. It was a brilliant, calculated political move to prevent the total collapse of society. By restoring a base level of economic freedom, the king prevented a permanent underclass from forming and staved off revolts that could topple his throne. These acts recognized a fundamental truth that we often forget today. In the ancient world, debt was never seen as just a financial number. It was a deeply personal, powerful social relationship, a tether of obligation that connected your fate directly to another's. Managing that tether was essential, for when the chains of debt grew too heavy for too many, the entire social order trembled on the brink. That delicate balance between debt and freedom required a special kind of place to flourish on a global scale. For the grandest deals between entire empires, the standard marketplace was not enough. The solution was the port of trade, a cosmopolitan crossroads deliberately built on neutrality. These were not typical cities, they were economic sanctuaries, often established on coastal islands or contested borderlands. Think of ancient Delos, declared a free port by Rome, its harbors filled with ships from Egypt, Phoenicia, and Greece. Or Carthage, a powerhouse whose wealth flowed from its carefully managed ports that welcomed every merchant who could pay the tariff. These zones operated under a unique set of rules, a special legal status that offered foreign traders protection from arbitrary seizure and predictable, published tax rates. Inside these walls, a Ptolemaic Egyptian and a Seleucid Syrian could negotiate as equals, their political rivalries temporarily suspended by the higher law of commerce. This enforced neutrality created a bubbling cultural laboratory. To communicate, merchants developed simplified, hybrid languages, pidgin tongues that mixed vocabulary from a dozen different shores. These were not elegant, but they were effective, a practical grammar for the price of pepper and the terms of a loan. The port of trade became a living experiment in globalization, centuries before the word existed. Here, the social codes of the desert caravanserai met the legal traditions of the sea, blending and adapting into something entirely new. A dispute between a Roman and a Nabatean trader would be settled by a mixed merchant council, drawing on a blend of Roman law and Arabian custom to find a fair solution. This was a world where identity became fluid, where a person was defined less by their birthplace and more by their trade and their credit. The primary allegiance was to the deal itself. These hubs proved that when the profit of peaceful exchange is made clear enough, even the most bitter rivals can build a temporary world together, forging the economic and cultural bridges that would, in time, bind entire continents into a single, humming network of trade. The ports of trade and caravan routes became the world's first universities, and the merchants were its wandering professors. They carried far more than cargo in their saddlebags and ship holds. Tucked between bolts of silk and sacks of pepper were the most transformative goods of all, new ways of seeing the world. This was the 17th code, the trader as a cultural ambassador, an unwitting agent of ideas that would quietly reshape entire civilizations. A merchant traveling from India to China did not just bring spices, he carried the subtle concepts of Buddhism, planting philosophical seeds in foreign soil that would one day grow into vast monastic traditions. Along the Silk Road, the designs on a Persian carpet or the pattern on a piece of Roman glass could inspire an artist in a Central Asian workshop, creating a new hybrid aesthetic that spanned continents. The very numerals we use today, a system far more powerful than Roman numerals for complex calculation, migrated from India into the Islamic world and were then carried by Arab traders across the Mediterranean into medieval Europe. These were not formal cultural exchanges, they were accidental transmissions, a byproduct of the long, intimate conversations that happen on the road. To be successful, a merchant had to become a master of cultural code switching. He needed to understand which hand gestures were respectful in one kingdom and deeply offensive in the next. He learned the basic prayers of a foreign faith to show respect at a local temple, and he absorbed enough of a new language to negotiate not just for price but for trust. This constant, practical adaptation made the merchant a unique bridge between worlds. He was a living filter, absorbing stories from one culture and sharing them with another, often softening the strange and foreign into something more relatable. When he returned home, he brought back more than exotic goods. He carried tales of distant cities with different laws, strange customs, and fascinating beliefs. This steady, informal drip of information did more to break down isolation and prejudice than any royal edict. The marketplace, therefore, was never just an economic space. It was a grand, ongoing conversation between cultures, a conversation mediated by the only person who had a vested interest in keeping the dialogue open, the trader whose livelihood depended on understanding the world in all its beautiful, complicated diversity. A merchant's word was only as strong as the fear behind it. In a world without signed contracts or forensic evidence, the most binding agreements were sealed not with a signature, but with an oath to a wrathful deity. A trader swearing by the river god Styx in ancient Greece, or invoking the sun god Shamash in Mesopotamia, was doing far more than making a promise. He was placing his entire fate, his health, and his family's future into the hands of a divine power. The belief was absolute and terrifying that the god would personally enforce the contract, striking down the perjurer with disease, poverty, or the loss of his children. This was not a vague superstition. It was a powerful legal and psychological tool. The fear of supernatural punishment was often a far greater deterrent than any earthly fine. It created a level of accountability that reached into the soul, ensuring a man would think twice before breaking an oath, even if no human witness was present. For disputes where the truth was utterly obscured, societies turned to even more dramatic methods, the ordeal. Imagine a trader accused of selling fake silver. His word against his accusers, the solution was to call upon the gods to judge. In one common practice, the accused would be forced to grasp a red-hot metal bar or plunge his hand into boiling water. His hand was then bandaged. If after 3 days the wound had cleanly healed, the gods had proclaimed his innocence. If it festered, his guilt was confirmed. This was not seen as primitive barbarism, but as a sacred form of divine arbitration. The entire community believed the gods would not allow an innocent person to be truly harmed. The psychological pressure of undergoing such a test was itself a powerful filter, often compelling a guilty party to confess rather than face the fire or the water. These rituals provided a definitive, community-accepted resolution to conflicts that otherwise had no clear solution, preventing endless cycles of vendetta and restoring a sense of order. This deep fusion of faith and commerce reveals a fundamental truth about the ancient marketplace. It was not a secular space. Every transaction, every promise, was underwritten by the ever-watchful eyes of the gods, making honesty a matter of cosmic consequence. While merchants swore oaths to the gods over their silver, kings and emperors were playing a far grander and more perilous game. At the highest levels of power, commerce shed its mundane skin entirely, transforming into an elaborate theater of gift-giving. This was the 19th code, the prestige economy, where the most valuable objects on earth were never bought, only given. An Egyptian pharaoh would dispatch a caravan not to sell, but to present the king of Babylon with a gift of solid gold statues, rare ebony wood, and live giraffes. In return, he expected a counter-gift of equal magnificence, perhaps lapis lazuli from distant mountains or teams of priceless white horses. This was not trade in the common sense. It was diplomacy disguised as generosity, a social code that bound entire empires together with silken threads of obligation. Primary currency here was not value, but honor and power. To give a more magnificent gift than you received was to publicly assert your superiority, your access to greater wealth and more exotic resources. The receiving ruler was caught in a delicate trap, honor bound to reciprocate with something even more splendid, or risk being seen as weak and impoverished in the eyes of the world. This created a relentless, silent competition that drove the entire engine of long-distance luxury trade. The demand for ivory, incense, rare spices, and blue gemstones was often fueled not by market desire, but by the desperate need of a king to save face and secure an alliance. A single exchange of gifts could weave a web of mutual obligation stronger than any written treaty, because it was a debt of honor played out before the entire civilized world. This system turned objects into messages and every royal treasury into a carefully managed arsenal of potential influence. Royal warehouses changed the very nature of possession. In Rome, the massive horia along the Tiber River were not simple sheds. They were fortresses of commerce with thick walls, guarded gates, and sophisticated systems to protect grain, olive oil, and exotic silks from thieves, fire, and rot. A merchant from Alexandria could sail into port, deposit his entire cargo of Egyptian papyrus into one of these secure public warehouses, and walk away with something far more valuable than a handful of coins. He received a simple piece of papyrus himself, a receipt. This slip of paper was a revolutionary social agreement. It was a token of trust issued by the warehouse keeper, a promise that the goods existed, that they were safe, and that they belonged to the person who held this document. That merchant no longer needed to physically guard his bales of papyrus. He could sell the receipt itself to a dealer in the forum, who could then sell it to a parchment maker in another part of the city. The papyrus never moved, but ownership changed hands multiple times, all based on the trust everyone placed in that warehouse and its paper promise. This was trade becoming abstract, evolving beyond the limits of hand-to-hand exchange. The same system operated on a colossal scale in the state granaries of Egypt, where the harvests of entire regions were stored, and clay tablet receipts allowed for the precise distribution of rations to workers and soldiers. This bureaucratic innovation meant that wealth was no longer just the physical stuff you owned. It was the certified claim to that stuff, a claim that could be transferred, inherited, or used as collateral for a loan. The warehouse receipt was a quiet revolution, transforming bulky, vulnerable cargo into a fluid, secure, and tradable form of capital. This paper trail grew even more sophisticated with the bill of lading. When a merchant placed his amphorae of wine on a ship bound for another continent, the ship's captain would issue this document. It was a triple promise rolled into one. It served as a receipt confirming the goods had been loaded, as a contract outlining the terms of the voyage, and most importantly, as a title, proving who had the right to claim the cargo at the distant destination. A merchant could now send his goods across the sea, and then send the bill of lading overland by a faster courier. His business partner in the foreign port could receive the document, walk onto the dock as the ship arrived, and present the paper to take possession, all without the original merchant ever making the journey. This system allowed strangers who would never meet to conduct business with perfect confidence. It bureaucratized trust, embedding it into a formal, written process. The creation of this legal and documentary framework was the final piece of the puzzle. It scaled the ancient codes of personal honor and reputation into a system that could manage the vast, impersonal flows of an imperial economy. These humble receipts and bills were the direct ancestors of the modern stock certificate and the letter of credit, proving that the most powerful structures in our financial world were built not on gold, but on a simple, universally accepted piece of paper. Yet, even as this system of paper promises and warehouse receipts created a new world of abstract trade, every society drew a firm, uncrossable line. The marketplace, for all its power, was never allowed to consume everything. There were certain pillars of community life deemed too sacred, too fundamental, to ever be assigned a price. This was the 21st code, the social limitation of market reach. In the bedrock of many ancient societies lay the concept of inalienable possessions. These were things that could not be legitimately sold, only passed down through generations as an inheritance or given as a profound ceremonial gift. Family land was the most classic example. To sell your ancestral plot was not just a bad financial move, it was a form of social and spiritual suicide. That land held the bones of your ancestors and the identity of your lineage. Converting it into a handful of coins broke a sacred chain of custody, dissolving your family's place in the world. Similarly, in ancient Rome, you could not simply purchase a priesthood. These religious offices were filled by birthright or by appointment, their authority flowing from tradition and divine favor, not from a competitive bid. To put such a role up for sale would have been seen as a direct insult to the gods, corrupting the very channel of communication with the divine. Even the trade in human beings had its own complex and often horrifying boundaries. In many cultures, you could not sell a fellow tribesman or a citizen into slavery. That fate was reserved for foreign captives of war or people acquired from outside the community. Selling one of your own was a taboo of the highest order, a violation of the shared blood and mutual obligation that held the society together. These taboos were not mere superstitions. They were vital social firewalls protecting the community's core from the corrosive logic of pure commercialism. They ensured that some relationships remained permanent, based on kinship and duty, rather than temporary and based on cash. The values a society held most dear are not always revealed by what it eagerly traded, but by what it fiercely kept out of the marketplace. By drawing this line, ancient peoples declared that some things, the things that gave their world meaning and stability, were simply not for sale. The relentless drive to trade did not just move goods, it forged the very tools that measured the world. Behind every successful merchant stood a growing arsenal of intellectual technology, devices born from the urgent need to calculate, record, and navigate with precision. The simplest and most universal of these was the abacus. In the noisy chaos of any marketplace from Rome to Chang'an, you would see fingers flying over beads strung on wires, performing complex calculations in seconds. This was the ancient world's calculator, turning the abstract concept of value into a physical, manageable process. But numbers alone were not enough. The sheer volume of deals, loans, and partnerships demanded a memory more reliable than any single merchant's mind. This pressure gave birth to one of humanity's most profound inventions, writing. In ancient Mesopotamia, the need to record transactions for barley and sheep led to the first marks pressed into clay tablets, the system we call cuneiform. Writing began not as poetry or history, but as accounting. It was commerce that demanded a permanent record, a way to make a promise stick beyond the lifespan of the people who made it. This tool transformed society, creating a class of scribes and a system of law based on written precedent. Out on the open sea, the challenges were even greater. A merchant's fortune and his life depended on knowing where he was. The magnetic compass, originally a Chinese divination tool, was adapted for navigation, allowing ships to sail under cloudy skies. The astrolabe, a sophisticated model of the heavens, allowed sailors to plot their latitude by the stars. These were not toys for philosophers. They were essential instruments funded by merchant guilds and trading families desperate to reduce the immense risks of their voyages. Better navigation demanded better ships. The Phoenicians, masters of Mediterranean trade, developed the galley, a vessel capable of long journeys with a heavy cargo. Later, the Arab dhow, with its lateen sail, could tack against the wind, opening up new trade routes across the Indian Ocean. This was a powerful feedback loop, a code of practical innovation. The pursuit of profit identified a problem, like the difficulty of calculating a complex barter or the peril of a lost ship. Solving that problem required a new tool, whether it was a counting board or a sturdier hull. And each new tool, in turn, unlocked the potential for more ambitious and complex commerce, pushing the boundaries of the known world ever further. The marketplace, therefore, was not just a place of exchange, but a crucible of invention, where the need to trust a stranger with your goods ultimately gave us the tools to understand our universe. For every rule etched in stone, a shadow economy thrived in the forgotten coves and darkened alleyways. The glittering trade routes that built empires also created a golden opportunity for those willing to live outside the law. Piracy was the relentless predator of the ancient seas. From the swift ships of the sea peoples who terrorized the Bronze Age Mediterranean to the Illyrian raiders of the Adriatic, these were not random thieves but highly organized criminals. They targeted the lifeblood of empires, the grain ships from Egypt and the silver-laden galleys from Spain, operating from hidden bases with their own brutal codes of loyalty and a swift, violent form of justice for any crew member who broke ranks. On land, the same impulse took the form of smuggling, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with the tax collector. A merchant might carefully hollow out a ceramic amphora, filling its core with rare saffron to avoid a crushing import duty, or a caravan master might bribe a garrison commander to look the other way as untaxed silk slipped past a customs post. This was not seen as simple theft, but as a rational response to the heavy hand of official greed. Then there were the black markets, the secret spaces where demand met forbidden supply. In Rome, a city obsessed with public morality, sumptuary laws forbade the wearing of certain shades of purple or the consumption of exotic foods by anyone outside the senatorial class. Yet in the right tavern with the right whisper, you could acquire the very silks and spices that defined elite status. These illicit networks operated on a code of absolute silence and ruthless enforcement, where a single loose tongue could lead to a disappearance. This shadow world proves a fundamental, enduring truth. The drive for profit is a force that constantly tests the boundaries of any system. For every social code designed to build trust, a parallel set of rules emerge to exploit it, reminding us that the history of commerce is written not only in ledgers and laws, but also in the secret deals and hidden cargo holds of those who danced in the darkness. That central, beating heart of the city had a physical rhythm all its own, a pulse you could trace in the very stones beneath your feet. The grand agora of a Greek city-state was never tucked away in a quiet corner. It was the sprawling, open plaza where every major street inevitably led. In Rome, the Forum was the undeniable nucleus, a valley between the city's sacred hills where the Senate House, the chief temples, and the rostra for public speeches stood shoulder to shoulder with bustling market stalls. This urban design was a deliberate choice, a physical declaration that commerce was inseparable from every other facet of civic life. Your journey to pay respects at the temple, to serve on a jury, or to hear a political debate would invariably take you through the marketplace. You could not be a citizen without engaging with this space. The city's layout forced a constant, vibrant intersection of activities. A politician rallying support in the Roman Forum would have to project his voice over the din of merchants haggling over the price of Spanish olive oil. A pilgrim leaving a temple in Athens would mingle with shoppers examining bolts of fine Egyptian linen. This was not an accident, it was a masterstroke of social engineering. By placing the market at the literal and symbolic center, ancient planners ensured that the flow of goods was constantly intertwined with the flow of ideas, laws, and prayers. The marketplace became the city's primary mixing chamber, where people of all classes and professions were compelled to cross paths, to overhear conversations, and to participate in the shared project of community. The wide, colonnaded walkways of an Islamic bazaar leading directly to the Grand Mosque made the same profound statement. Your economic life, your spiritual life, and your legal life were not separate compartments. They were different facets of a single, unified existence, all revolving around the sacred commercial core. The city itself, in its most fundamental blueprint, was a monument to the enduring power of the market's social codes. The echoes of those ancient marketplaces still hum within every modern transaction. The digital reputation of a five-star seller on an online marketplace is the direct descendant of the Assyrian merchant's good name, a fragile form of capital now quantified in algorithms and customer reviews instead of whispered stories in a caravanserai. Our global system of contract law, with its dense pages of legal clauses, is the formalized evolution of the elder's judgment under the sacred tree, a way to systematically enforce promises between strangers who may never meet. The coins in your pocket, or more likely the digits in your bank account, are the ultimate expression of the imperial seal, a universal metric of value guaranteed not by a king's face but by the full faith of a nation-state. Even the simple act of clicking buy now on a website requires a staggering leap of faith, a modern version of the silent trade. You are sending your payment into the digital void, trusting an unseen entity on the other side of the world to honor the agreement and ship the product, just as one group would leave their goods on a deserted beach and trust a second, invisible group to leave a fair payment in return. The foundational concept of the market's peace That neutral ground where conflict was suspended for commerce, is now enshrined in international trade law and special economic zones, modern sanctuaries where geopolitical tensions are theoretically set aside for the mutual benefit of trade. The fundamental human challenges have not changed. We are still building bridges of trust across vast distances of culture and suspicion, still relying on a shared grammar of value and a system of consequences for broken promises. The technology has transformed from clay tablets to cloud servers, from stone weights to SSL encryption, but the core social codes, the invisible architecture that allows us to trust a stranger with our livelihood, remain the enduring legacy of those first dusty market squares. History holds a terrifying secret that the mighty fortress of civilization can crumble not from a single invasion, but from the slow, silent erosion of trust. The grand empires of the late Bronze Age, from the Hittites in Anatolia to the Mycenaeans in Greece and the pharaohs in Egypt, were not isolated islands. They were nodes in a vast, humming network of trade and diplomacy, a system held together by the very social codes we have been exploring. They exchanged not only goods, but also royal letters etched on clay tablets, sealed with the promise of mutual support. A king in Egypt would ship grain to a Hittite counterpart struggling with drought, fully expecting a future shipment of silver or military aid in return. This was the prestige economy operating at a geopolitical scale, a delicate dance of gift and obligation that kept the entire Eastern Mediterranean stable and prosperous for centuries. Then, around the year 1200 before the Common Era, it all came crashing down. Great palaces were burned to the ground, cities were abandoned, and literacy itself virtually disappeared from the Greek world for hundreds of years. This was not a single event, but a system's collapse, and its roots lay in the failure of the foundational codes. A prolonged period of drought and famine, possibly triggered by a volcanic eruption and climate shift, placed immense strain on the entire network. The sacred obligation of reciprocity began to buckle under the pressure of sheer survival. When a kingdom on the brink of starvation could no longer fulfill its gift debt to an ally, the bonds of diplomatic trust shattered. The peace of the trade route evaporated, replaced by desperation. The ships of the sea peoples, once perhaps traders themselves, turned to piracy, attacking the weakened maritime arteries that carried tin and copper, the essential ingredients for bronze and for war. Without that reliable flow of resources, local economies imploded. The imperial seals lost their meaning as central authorities crumbled, and the standardized weights and measures they guaranteed became useless. The complex, interdependent system, which had functioned so smoothly on a foundation of mutual obligation and enforced peace, simply seized up. The collapse of the Bronze Age world stands as a stark monument to a simple, brutal truth. The walls and armies we often see as the pillars of power are merely the surface. The true infrastructure, the invisible framework that allows civilization to function, is woven entirely from threads of social agreement. When those threads of trust are cut, the entire tapestry can unravel with shocking speed, leaving only silence and ashes in its wake. From a handful of grain traded at a sacred crossroads to the complex digital transactions of today, the story of commerce is fundamentally a story of human connection. The social codes of ancient markets were never just about moving goods. That sacred peace, that binding handshake, that shared language of weights, these were the true building blocks. They formed the mortar that held together the very foundations of empires, teaching diverse and often suspicious peoples the profound power of cooperation. This framework of trust created pockets of stability in a chaotic world, allowing knowledge to spread, technologies to cross continents, and the first, fragile threads of a global community to be woven. As you navigate our own intricate economic landscape with its digital marketplaces and global supply chains, remember these deep roots. Behind every line of code in a smart contract, behind every digit in a bank transfer, the fundamental principle remains unchanged. It is the enduring human need to connect, to trust a stranger with our livelihood, and to collectively build a better world, one agreement at a time. We would love to hear from you. Which of these ancient market codes, from the peace of the market to the power of the guild, do you find most fascinating for our world today? Let us know your thoughts in the